It's nefarious, man. Like, the brain works in fucked up ways.
The mind is one of the most deceiving, manipulative pieces of equipment, flesh, human bodies on earth. I never have trusted my brain.
All of that weight lives in your head, and you are the decision maker.
Psychology of Entrepreneurship.
Hi, it's Ronsley. If this is your first volume, welcome. This is a weekly series where I go inside the mind of an entrepreneur, artist, athlete, academic to decipher what is the psychology of our decisions. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I am standing on today. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation. This is an extremely emotional volume for me. I've cried a lot through the creation of this. When I heard the elders speak in Brisbane during the Black Lives Movement rally, where tens of thousands gathered to give a voice to the history of our country, this country, I'm even crying typing this. I can't help it. Tears are just flowing. The research made me cry, the conversation made me cry, and this might make you cry. So, if that isn't where you're at, now isn't the time to listen to this. I am very, very proud to be Australian, even though I look Indian, and I've had to explain that a lot. But can you imagine that you have to explain how you are Australian when you belong to this land? Today, I'm talking with
Mark Yettica-Paulson, that's who I am, and I am a facilitator, particularly around Indigenous leadership, or what's called intercultural leadership, where you try to bring groups together. That's my main thing that I do. And over the last perhaps 20, 25 years, I've been working in the space where you want to help grow and foster and develop First Nations leadership, but you also have to impact the conditions that they go and do their leadership in, which is the environment around them.
Mark, that is an extremely complex set of connections there, and I suppose responsibility, because
you also need to develop the skills in partnering with people who are from the so-called other side. How do you partner and make alliances? And so there's not just cultural leadership and strength, but it's about leadership reaching across. And so I've been doing that for the last 20 years or so, and it has brought me through various arenas, a little bit of a stint in government, but only enough to realise I'm not built that way. And I've been working primarily in community organisations, not-for-profit, private sector, campaigning work, and doing a bit of work on my own. So that's it in a nutshell.
In February 1999, 4 New York City police officers were on patrol in the Bronx when they saw a young black man standing on a stoop. They thought he looked suspicious. When they pulled over, he retreated into the doorway and began digging in his pocket. He kept digging as the police shouted at him to show his hands. A few seconds later, the man, Amadou Diallo, a 23-year-old immigrant from Guinea, was dead, hit by 19 of the 41 bullets that the police fired at him. What Diallo was reaching for was his wallet. He was going for his ID as he stood on the steps of his own apartment building. Diallo's story and the officer's fatal prejudgment of him is recounted in Malcolm Gladwell's 2005 bestseller, Blink. Gladwell and the social psychologist whose work he draws upon explores Diallo's case as an example of that gray area between deliberate violence and an accident, propagated by non-conscious or implicit biases. The officers did discriminate against Diallo, but the prejudice they acted on may have been driven by something more subtle than simple hatred. And that's an important thing to think about. Yes, there are lots of overtly bigoted people and policies at work all over the world, but what we're interested in today is the more insidious, non-conscious, automatic bias and how it can affect our behavior. The fact is, our implicit biases affect the way we relate to others in a very real way.
Huge props to the creators of that story, which you should check out in its entirety. The link to that will be in the show notes. So, before we get started, I want to acknowledge some facts. These facts are from a peer-reviewed journal, so all the sources have been verified and reviewed. Open quotes. The history of Indigenous people in Australia over the last 200 years since the arrival of Europeans is one of great suffering. Genocide, the introduction of European diseases, dispossession, subjugation, and segregation reduced the Indigenous population by 90% between 1788 and 1900. A conservative estimate indicates that prior to European contact, there were approximately 15,000 Indigenous Australians living in the state of Victoria. That number was reduced to approximately 850 by 1901. Today, Indigenous Australians continue to face interpersonal and institutional racism, which creates and sustains their lower socioeconomic status by excluding them from economic opportunities and land ownership. Moreover, Indigenous men and women can expect to live 10.6 and 9.5 years less than non-Indigenous men and women, respectively. A large and growing body of evidence consistently implicates racism as a key determinant of the health of Indigenous Australians. However, one of the most persistent aspects of today's discourse regarding racism in Australia is the very denial of its existence. A review of the linguistic and discursive patterns of contemporary speech in both informal and formal parliamentary debates, political speeches, and the media is considered formal. Settings in Australia concluded that the social taboo against openly expressing racist beliefs has led to the development of strategies that present negative views of minority groups as reasonable and justified, while exonerating the speaker from charges of racism. This serves to constrain political efforts to address racism, thus reinforcing racism. End quote. This study in its entirety and all the references can be found in the show notes. So, if you didn't know, now you do. Mark Yettica-Paulson, thank you for being here. I am extremely blessed to be talking with you. There has got to be an element of stereotyping in the work that you do. Is there?
The dynamic that people of colour face, or not just people of colour, but people for whom there is this build-up of stereotypical, those people do that. Those people, they're like this. So you end up carrying around the psychology of asking yourself an internal question, were they just being rude or were they being racist? Or were they being rude or just sexist? Or were they being rude or just seeing my social class and looking down on me? I don't know if I had told you this story, but it's the reality of when you walk into an airline lounge, and people may remember that we used to go to the airport and used to go to the airport lounges, but when you walk in there, and as a brown-skinned person, I have to consciously think that I need to make sure that the way I present myself in an airport lounge I cannot afford to be disheveled and kind of rough-shaven and daggy clothes. The difference that gets cast that I carry around from my own psychological point of view and the data that I process around me is that a disheveled-looking white person, white male, same age as me, walks into an airport lounge and they go, they're an artist, or maybe they're a rock star or a film director, or maybe they're they're something like that. They're clearly an edgy kind of creative type. I walk in there disheveled, and it's like, excuse me, sir, I don't think this is where you need to be. You need to be out there, Forget the fact that I've got gold membership, There's like, oh, sorry, sir. We thought we had our lens on. And so you carry this around. I don't know if they're being rude or racist. Now, for that to be our psychological baggage and for other Australians to not even know that exists is part of our work. We can't bring to consciousness unless people have developed the thinking about who they are and where they're from, unless they get somebody else to hold a mirror up to their own behaviour. And if you can get away with never having a mirror held up to your own behaviour, then in some ways your psychological cultural resilience is weak, not as well developed as someone who's had to be in a fighter's stance psychologically as they walk around land that they thought, they believed was their inheritance. You can imagine the mental gymnastics that happens when you're like, okay, I'm being put down on the land that is my inheritance from 1,000 generations. Why aren't I walking around like I am the prince of this region? What is going on in the society around me and inside me that's preventing me from walking around stately on the land that is my inheritance? That to me is part of what's going on underneath the surface here amongst my fellow Australians.
So anyone listening going, why is this our problem? This happened a while ago. For one, I'm really happy that hopefully you'll listen to the end to get a better perspective for that thought. Because I promise you that we fact-checked this sucker, and enough with the facts. Well, maybe just a bit more. This is Tiffany Janner in her TEDx talk, The Power of Privilege.
Now, I don't know if you guys noticed, but I'm going to let you in on something. I'm a black woman. I know, right? A bunch of you don't even see color, so you didn't even notice, but I'm just saying. So I was frustrated that some people in our society had more privilege than I did. I was frustrated that when I walked into a job interview, I had to deal with the stereotypes and assumptions that other people had of me before I even walked in the door. That I had to work twice as hard to be seen as equally competent. That when I travel, airport security searches through my hair. I was frustrated that our society has bought into a belief system that some human beings have more value than others. That some people are perceived as more intelligent than others simply because they have a different skin color.
The Australian National University conducted a survey in 2019 collecting data from 4,600 government primary and secondary students across New South Wales and Victoria. From these results, 60% of surveyed school students said that they had witnessed racism, 40% of Aboriginal and students from ethnic minority backgrounds said that they'd been racially discriminated against by their peers, and more than a third of Aboriginal students reported experiences of racial discrimination from wider society.
When I had my first grandchild, I made a vow to myself that her and my future grandchildren would speak language, Darringal language.
Every January 26th, there are displays of jingoism and nationalism all across this country as Australians celebrate the day that the First Fleet sailed into Sydney Cove. But for Aboriginal people, this day has always been one of pain and grief. It's been referred to as the Day of Mourning, Invasion Day, Survival Day, and Sovereignty Day. I'm going to embark on a journey through the past, present and future of Aboriginal Australia to find out where this grief and pain originates and what can happen in the future to ensure that we heal the wounds of the past and move forward together.
That is a 3-part BuzzFeed news documentary that you can watch in under 30 minutes, which will give you a lot of education and perspective. Mark, for context, let's start with the kind of work that you do.
So on any given piece of work around leadership development for me, I'll be working with the culture and identity of the people involved. So for First Nations people, First Nations Australians, there is the context around how do they be authentic to their own ethnicity, their own background, their own history and memory as a cultural people, but also how do they fit into the modern environment in secular society here in Australia and how we find our place in the world. And most of my work is focused on building up that internal strength and resilience that's already there, but how do you build on that so that the leadership of First Nations not only looks after their own people by keeping them feel safe and with a strong sense of belonging, but is able to work across in the Australian context with all other Australians in order to achieve what we need to achieve together. We're at a community level, at government, programmatic level, or in a business sense, to be able to kind of do some innovation that works on the horizons that we haven't seen yet. You won't be able to do that as First Nations if you're not strong in and of yourself in terms of your own identity and belonging and your own cultural resilience that you will need as an individual.
Identity. I can relate. In India, I speak with an accent. In Australia, I speak with an accent. In America, I definitely speak with an accent. Also, for context, I want you to know, if you were curious, what were some of the challenges Mark faces in the work that he does?
I think one of our challenges that we face in the dialogue is that we think that proximity equals legitimacy. So if you are really, really close to it, you have all the legitimacy to talk about it. But if you're far away from it, if your proximity keeps you at a distance, then you are illegitimate and you don't deserve the right, or you're not allowed to make comment. And part of our challenge then with that equation, or that understanding that proximity, equals legitimacy, that then we find ourselves saying, well, how can we even begin to understand what has happened, what is happening, what is going on? Who can we turn to? Oh, well, we need somebody who's like a fantasy of Indigenous leadership, someone who's lived 100 years in a community, who's also lived 100 years in the city, who knows 100 years worth of knowledge about rural and regional communities as well, can speak about politics, health, housing, education, all the facets of that, then have an understanding of philosophy and religion, because that impacts somehow as well, and really have a firm understanding about law and systems of, high courts and Supreme Courts, etc. Then that person needs to break it down and make it nice and simple for us. You can see that this cannot happen. You can't find someone with all of those attributes of proximity to say they can do it. They're super legit. So the reason why I respond like this straight away is that part of the shock that hits Australians is this dynamic. Why weren't we told? Why wasn't this part of our upbringing? Why is it we're finding this out now as adults, things that we should have known as part of the history of Australia?
Why weren't we told? I wasn't told. I became Australian fairly recently. I have to renew my passport, so I'd say over 10 years ago. Also, what most people don't know is that I had to give up my Indian passport because India doesn't allow dual citizenship. So, I had to make my peace with that fact. And I took my oath of allegiance to be Australian. What I didn't like was that pledge is still kinda to Her Majesty Elizabeth II. Why is that still a thing? I suppose that's for another volume. But here was my pledge. From this time forward, under God, I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. I remember that pledge, especially today when I publish this, because this needs to be shared knowledge.
And I try to hold that with a balanced view around, we can't be blamed for not having that present in our upbringing. It's like when you look at any adult who's grown up, their childhood informs their identity and resilience and knowledge, etc., the way they move in the world and live in the world. And so we can't look at Australians who are like, look, it was never brought in front of me. It was never part of my schooling. It was never part of my circle of friends conversation, except what we picked up around the edges in our peripheral vision through news snippets or usually stereotypes that may not be shining brightly or on our relationship. And not enough knowledge then becomes shared knowledge, jointly understood knowledge. So in a way, our history is not our common sense. Our history is being relegated to, let's have some people who can write books on it, and then some of us will read some of those books, rather than all of us saying, this is actually our pathway, this is our common sense, we grew up like this, and some of that stuff is not a good story, but some of the stuff is awesome. That's the challenge, I think, that presents itself for a country like Australia, but like many around the world. But if we focus on this context, we have an opportunity to not only say, here's our relationship with the oldest continuing cultures on Earth, but here's our relationship with all the cultures on Earth as well. All of us living here, and we've got an amazing, eclectic cultural identity that we're just not tapping into.
When we come back, the two things you shouldn't talk about at the dinner table.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
The main objective of this audio project is to bring together entrepreneurs and creatives who share similar values so that they can find the courage to put out their authentic voice for the right people to hear, which allows for them to make their impact on the world. Every great movement started with a memorable speech. For access to full-length interviews, go to psychologyofentrepreneurship.com and click the button.
So, what shouldn't you talk about at the dinner table? Let Ronsley from 3 years ago tell you. This is from my TED Talk.
We've always approached, different conversations, and we've been told, as long as you don't talk about religion and politics, it'll be fine. We won't have a disagreement, and everyone will be happy. But those are the two institutions we should be challenging. We should be talking about, because they've changed our perspective of the world. They've given us this lens.
Have you ever heard the saying that there's two things you shouldn't talk about at dinner? Those two things is politics and religion. So I grew up, and those two are the main things that is the topic. They are the topics of conversation at dinner, politics and religion. So if you want to clear a room, or if you want to spark a heated defensive conversation, then you bring those topics up. And in Australian context, our relationship with our First Nations people is one of those areas where it's like, look, if we don't have to talk about it, we'd prefer not to. Well, one of the things that I think is core with this, and I'll get to those dynamics about First Nations people in a second, but one of the core dynamics to the reasons why this is such a big deal is the dynamic around shallow memory. Most of us cannot remember things, and our current modern society, it runs on, it survives, it thrives, it gains momentum by all of us having shallow memory. So what we start doing is we start saying, back in the day, and then we go way back in the day. I asked my son, because he used that phrase, he goes, what? That's like back in the day. It's like way back in the day. I said, can we just ask you, what do you mean by way back in the day? And he said, that's like 2010. And I'm like, wow. So 2010 is way back in the day for someone who's like, 13, 14. And that notion that we live in a world that has such shallow memory, we get confronted by people who carry around a much longer sense of identity and belonging from a much deeper memory. That becomes confronting, because we all know we have ancient ancestors. We all know we have grandparents who had grandparents who had grandparents. That goes back to, at some point, way, way, way back. But not everyone carries that memory with them. So for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, for First Nations people here to be talking about things that impact this generation and carrying around memory of 3-4 generations, it's like, that's easy to do, because we come from a culture of people who carry 20 or 100 generations through our stories. Now, there are other cultures who do this. This is not peculiar to First Nations people. Somebody did make Stonehenge, for example. Somebody did decide to construct the pyramids. Somebody did decide to write down the stories of some people in what's now known as the Middle East and turned it into a sacred text for, 3 world religions now. So this notion that having long memory is not peculiar to First Nations people here. It is a dynamic that is around as human beings. But the reason why that's such a significant point to us is that when we talk about, in order for us to survive in this modern reality, we need acknowledgement and recognition of the way that we have grown up as a country. And we have people saying, that doesn't affect us, it doesn't impact us. And they're responding with their shallow memory, and they're responding with let's all be future-focused and not history-focused. But we know that that's also not true, because on the 25th of April, we become very historically focused. On the 25th of December, we become historically focused, trying to call on traditions. So here in the context of Australia, we have people talking about the negative impacts of policies that happened 1, 2, 3 generations ago. But we also have people talk with clarity about their sense of the impact of first contact and the impact of first contact with the Western ways of being and in the world. And people are still carrying that memory around. And we turn to our fellow Australians and say, look, you need to get with the times. We're a modern society here. And for me, the work around the intercultural work where we work together is about trying to wrestle with that disconnect and around some people can carry that long memory and talk about its pain and suffering while other people can't. So we have manifestation of that. It's all around, where people will say, look, there's, you look at any socio-economic indicator and people can say there's an overrepresentation of First Nations people there. You'll also then have people with their notions about how to solve those issues. Some people have dedicated their entire careers, their lives, to working on those issues. I think what's missing is for millions of Australians to turn around and go, you know what, that's just the way, that's who we are. And this is our stuff that we need to work with and we need to focus on. So I think if people are listening from outside of an Australian context, it is difficult to grasp the severity that First Nations people feel around those social indicators, socioeconomic indicators, whether that's health or justice system or economic access to economic enfranchisement. That whatever the notion is, you have a narrative here that says the First Nations people are overrepresented in disadvantage. But we also have to be honest with the rising professional class around the First Nations people as well. And I would be one of them. The people who don't occupy the low socioeconomic statistics, but who are trying to chart a pathway out from that, and in order to participate in the modern economy, the modern world. And there is a growing class of that. The numbers of people who not only have university graduate degrees, but have postgraduate degrees. The disproportionate number of people who are able to access high levels of government because they are Indigenous leaders. It is something that we all need to reframe as our stereotypes, and rather than say Indigenous people, First Nations people are bereft of power, we can look at it and go, there's actually some power and agency here and positivity here that we're not seeing. There is a resilience here that ought to belong to all of us as Australians. How you can go from the brink of civilization, of your cultural ways of being lost, to it thriving and you participating in the world of business, the world of politics, and all the health and wealth of the nation is there for you to access.
In 2009, Aboriginal filmmaker and author Stephen Hagan wrote an article around racism in the Koori Mail confessing, "I'm on public record as saying Australians are the most racist people in the developed world for their treatment of the first Australians. And I make this claim comfortable in the knowledge that I am sufficiently supported by incontestable statistical data." And the data is there to back it up even 11 years later. There's a link in the show notes to that news article, as well as another really great article that was posted recently by creative spirits surrounding racism in Aboriginal Australia. You can find a ton of facts and links here to research further.
I suppose at the end of the day, it's all a matter of identity.
The challenge and the beauty about looking or peeling back matters of identity is that it's so multi-layered, it's multi-dimensional, and where things become difficult in the space is when elements or attributes of our cultural identity makeup become under contest or become threatened. And we know that it's a mixture. It's a concoction of what our folk tales are, our folklore, what our parents have told us, you are this person and you come from these things and you are your lineage is this, and so we grow up with a folklore that's told to us. But then we also have our biological attributes, what our physically we look like, whether we look similar to those people, whoever they are, or whether we don't look similar to those people. And then, of course, you've got your own determination that you self-identify and push out into the world. And through some sort of concoction of that and the way that other communities around us see us regardless, we find that we have to navigate our identity in that sort of space. And so many people will do all sorts of things. Will say, I am a strong such and such a person, or will say, hey, look, it kind of doesn't matter. I'm a human of the world in this moment. So let's, just be humans together. And right across that spectrum, you've got, a whole range of ways that people declare that. The reason why it's such a big deal in the First Nations Indigenous space is it's so hotly contested and it is a political declaration. If you can afford to not say that you are First Nations because you will be able to go unscathed from people casting negativity towards you or negative stereotypes, if you can afford to not declare that, then you're in a situation where you've got a different set of choices and around self-declaration. But if you look stereotypically like people think Aboriginal people of Australia need to look like, then you have no choice. And so how you declare your sense of identity and belonging is in itself a personal resilience, but unfortunately also in Australia it has political dimensions.
If you couldn't tell that I've started to embark on what I think is a topic that we will be going deep into, that is why we had to break this volume with Mark into 3. This one where we go into race and break that down before the second part of the conversation with Mark. And while this is a long journey, I don't want you to think that there is nothing you can do. Here's how not to be a spectator. Mark?
Yeah, that is actually, I think that's one of the profound realities of this space. When we spoke before, we talked about how this is often relegated to descendants of the First Fleet and descendants of the First Peoples. So it's either the British or white Australians and the Aboriginal Australians. They're the ones who have this dialogue, and the rest of us spectate. And what has occurred then, and what is even more escalated in our current times, is that we don't know the language. We haven't liberated ourselves with language that means we can talk about these things. We don't even know the questions to ask. We don't even know how to respond in a way that won't spark a Twitter storm on either side, or where everything is up for contestation. No one can give a very clear pathway ahead. And for me, then the response that I have, and I know that it's the way that I am perhaps wired up from a personality point of view, but for me, the way forward is to not find the right word or the right statement to make, but to find the right relationship. The relationship that's required is one where we are focused on building and creatively building trust amongst all of us. Enough trust for us to have the open dialogue so that we can stumble on our language. We can trip over the words. We can say, oh, look, I'm sorry about this. And there's enough trust that's been built for us to have a dialogue. At the moment, and even in our more modern, contemporary, immediate context around, if you say the wrong thing, then that could relegate you to an extreme racist or an extreme supremacist or extreme somethingist on either side. And that is not helpful for dialogue. And it means that the people who have been spectating will remain spectators because they're like, oh, I don't even know how to get in.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
Coming up on the psychology of entrepreneurship.
I mean, professionally, I think author and keynote speaker. I think those are the two main things that I do. And in 2008, when the U.S. economy crashed, I kind of crashed with it. That's when I came up with the Miracle Morning to turn that situation around. For me, I was committed to change 1 million lives one morning at a time, no matter what. There is no other option. If you go to YouTube and you type in Hal Elrod cancer, there are 4 cancer video vlogs that I recorded while I was going through it. And you can see my authentic attitude toward it. I'm like, hey guys, most of us think I'm happy and grateful when things are going good, right? But I'm here to tell you that no, when things are going bad, it's even more important.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
I interviewed Mark because he is the founder and chief of Super Native Unlimited, specializing in creative and cultural leadership development. Mark Yettica-Paulson has worked with organizations such as National Australia Bank, the Australian Football League, Medibank Australia, Australia Post, and the Foundation for Young Australians. He was Joint Campaign Director for Recognise, the recent campaign for a national referendum to amend the Australian Constitution to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and the removal of discrimination. Mark has developed the educational foundations for the Australians Together workshops and presentations while in his role as strategic business manager and key presenter. He is a TEDx speaker, a visionary, and a uniter of people.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
This is a Must Amplify production. Special thanks to every guest expert that has appeared on the show. Editing, voiceovers, and sound design by Kaylee Bonnyman and Tiago Vega. Guest research and content by Claire Gould and Corinne Castles. Project managed by Kaylee Bonnyman. Produced and hosted by me, Ronsley Vaz. For more episodes and where to listen, go to mustamplify.com/POE.
Hey, it's Kaylee from Must Amplify. I'm the sound engineer for this volume of Psychology of Entrepreneurship. I'm part of the team that made this production come alive. I work as a part of a global team with our studios based in West End, Brisbane, Australia. If you would like a podcasting checklist, email me at kaylee@amplifyagency.media. That's KAILI@amplifyagency.media. We specialize in finding your voice and making sure it's heard by the right people. If you are considering whether a podcast is a good idea for your business, check out our other show on shouldistartapodcast.com.